Good day, ladies and gentlemen, whatever time of day it happens to be as you're listening to this. It's time to play that favorite infinite inning game, the trigger warning game. There is a discussion of a murder-suicide coming up in the second act of the show. If this is the sort of thing that will put you off the pancake breakfast towards which even now you are happily riding, I advise you to put off, one or the other until later. As always, I do not indulge in graphic detail, but I know sometimes you just can't bear to hear about a certain something at the wrong time. We all have moments like that, especially right before those banana raisin pancakes are about to land on the table. But if you want to hear something really disgusting, I just saw this nugget during a ball game. Trent Grisham's bat speed is down 1.5 miles per hour versus last season. What does that suggest to me? That he is seriously deficient in banana raisin pancakes. Get that guy an IV, stat. And let's get us to the rest of the episode. I just wanted to let you know, because you know us at Infinite Inning Incorporated. We care. Thank you, the management. We could pick any number of teams as our example for the little discussion that we're about to have. It could be the 1988 Orioles, who, as you recall, opened that season by losing their first 21 games in a row. We could go with the expansion year Montreal Expos, who dropped 20 consecutive games beginning in mid-May, or the 1961 Phillies, who had the longest modern losing streak in history, dropping 23 consecutive games beginning July 29th. Both of those last two teams were managed by Gene Mauch, who always seemed to be around when something suspicious was happening in terms of losing streaks. It was just the sort of thing that tended to happen to Gene teams. Maybe he compulsively bunted his way to 3 weeks of one-run losses. Since modern is just an arbitrary concept, I'd like to talk instead about the apotheosis of sabotaged teams, the Cleveland Spiders of 1899. If you're not familiar with the Spiders, that's because they're dead, and also because we don't think of Cleveland as having a National League team. In a recent episode, we talked about John Ward, husband of Helen Dove Ray and her cup. In 1890, there was a battle between the National League American Association and Ward's Players League for Major League dominance. We discussed this in that episode, but possibly we were too focused on the cup for all of us to really absorb it, so I just thought I'd recap that a little bit now. There was just too much competition for turnstile spins in too small a part of the country then, and the upshot was that the Players League folded and the association was fatally wounded. It didn't wholly vanish, though, but in 1892 was partially absorbed into the National League. Both the early 20th century National and American Leagues, once the advent of the American League happened in 1901, had 8-team circuits, and they stayed that way for over half a century until expansion began in 1961. So that's another idea that we're used to. However, for about 7 years, the National League was swollen to 12 teams by the added association clubs. In 1899, the league decided that some of those teams weren't drawing well, and indeed they weren't, and they decided to fold 4 of them and get back down to 8. The Baltimore Orioles were merged with the Brooklyn Superbas or Bridegrooms or whatever they were calling the Dodgers back then. The Louisville Colonels were eaten by the Pirates, which turned Pittsburgh into a super team for a little while, which is, again, a hard idea for us to get used to in the present day. Do you know they have a winning record right now? The original Washington Senators and the Cleveland Spiders were just wished out to the cornfield and vanished. Puff. I can't speak to the original Senators just now, but the Spiders deserved it. It didn't have to be that way, but the Spiders were effectively murdered by their owners, the brothers Robeson. And let me clarify this much. When I say they deserved it, I mean the Robesons did, but then again, that was kind of their intention to begin with. The Spiders players were completely innocent, and if that's giving away my theme here a bit, so be it. I don't mind making that point twice. The team, which began in the association before moving to the National League in 1889, that happened a few times with the Cardinals, with the Reds too. It existed for 13 years. It never won a pennant, but it had 3 very strong second-place teams with records roughly equivalent to winning 100 games on a modern schedule. The 1892 team, which finished second, played the first place Boston, well, not yet Doves or Rustlers, or again, whatever they were calling the Braves back then, and they met in an early version of the World Series. The prior version of the World Series, again, as we talked about with Helen and her cup, happened between the National League pennant winner and the Association pennant winner. With the Association gone, they just had Seed 1 play Seed 2. Sure, they were blown out 5-0 with one tie, but they were there, and if you just go by the few good years that I mentioned, arguably this was a franchise that had more successful years than, say, the AL St. Louis Browns did. As late as 1896, they went 80-48 with, again, 7 ties, but the ties aside, that's an even 100-win pace. They also, at this point, had 3 future Hall of Famers on the roster. Young shortstop Bobby Wallace, who was young and not actually shortstopping yet. Shortstop till you get enough, but he hadn't figured out that he needed to shortstop yet. Outfielder Jesse Burkett, who hit a cranky .410 that year. And one of the big daddies of baseball history, Cy Young. And I don't call him big just because he put on a lot of weight at the end of his career, and he was driven into retirement because fellas kept bunting on him and he was incapable of bending over. I mean, at a certain point in our lives, who does not answer to that description? Me, if I drop something, I hope that either one of my kids is around to pick it up for me, or it's something that the cat can safely eat. Otherwise, I just sort of stare down at it helplessly for a while, and if no one comes along, I just wander off and figure someone will see it. Just 3 years later, all those 1896 players were still going strong, but what was left of the Spiders lost 24 consecutive games, dropping every contest they played between August 26th and September 16th. On the 17th, they somehow took a 1-run game from the similarly doomed for extinction Senators in the first contest of a doubleheader, but then they dropped the nightcap and proceeded to lose every game they had left on the schedule, going 0-16, or if you'd prefer to pull back the camera a bit, they went 1-40 over the approximate final quarter of the season. And all of those games were on the road because Cleveland fans rejected this zombified version of their team, and the brothers Robeson said, fine, we'll just leave. It's no skin off of our noses. Of course, the players didn't enjoy being on the road perpetually. Remember, that's not even jet travel. I mean, I happen to think that train travel is a much more civilized form of transportation, at least under optimal conditions, which arguably we haven't had in this country in like half a century. But it's still a schlep if you're going from, say, Cleveland to Brooklyn, chug, 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 and Brooklyn, too, has been turned into a very strong club, transiently, but still, because they absorbed all these future Hall of Fame players that the Orioles had. These are the famous old Orioles, the ones who were managed by Ned Hanlon. Well, now Ned Hanlon was managing Brooklyn, and he brought along Wee Willie Keeler and Joe Kelly and Huey Jennings, and the Spiders, who weren't a real team at this point, went 0-14 against them. That's a long ride for a short day at the beach. It reminds me of something that happened in the Russo-Japanese War. As you might recall, the Tsar and the Emperor went to war between, roughly 1904 and 1905, I guess, and the Japanese immediately sunk the Russian Pacific Fleet. Well, that was cool. The Russians had a Baltic fleet. It's just that you can't turn left and go around Alaska. They had to sail all the way out through the North Sea, where, very, very twitchy and thinking that the Japanese had somehow jumped continents, they attacked part of the British fishing fleet. I guess it was foggy that day, or the Russian telescopes hadn't been cleaned, which nearly dragged the British into the war. They sailed all the way around the Cape of Africa and so on, finally arrived back in the Pacific, at which point the Japanese sunk them too. That was a Cleveland Spiders road trip. At home, they were drawing maybe 100 a game. A lot of their attendance figures are reported as 100, and that just seems like a face-saving gesture for what was actually 3 drunks, 2 gamblers, the manager's mom, and an emaciated spaniel named Trevor. The writers had started referring to the team as the Exiles the year before, when the Robesons sent them on another long road trip for roughly the same reasons, but the insult was more appropriate in 1899. They were also referred to as the Misfits and the Discards. But if you were home, at least you could sleep in your own bed, and have some familiar food as opposed to whatever they serve people in Brooklyn in 1899. Probably Cthulhu-style creatures they yanked out of the Gowanus Canal, still reaching and biting and crying out in a voice like terrified sheep, but angry and signifying doom. Kind of like Applebee's is today. So how did they get there? How did they get into this position? Owners were then permitted to own more than one team in the same league. You'd think that the risk of self-dealing would have been kind of obvious, but they just didn't care. I mean, that was America in the 1890s. I don't know how else to say it, but this is why we needed a so-called progressive era, because everything was just corrupt at that time. We've never had anything like that again, and I'm sure we never will. We're so far past that now. Oh God, I'm going to be sick. I don't mean the 1890s only. I mean that whole part of American history. If you look back at the Civil War, here are profiteers who are selling, say, boots to the army, the Union Army, I mean, who are there to prevent Robert E. Lee from invading the North, which, as you know, he did a couple of times, getting as far as Pennsylvania, and he had plans. He had plans to go further had he not been checked at Gettysburg. But point being, these guys are there to make sure that your town isn't burned down, or worse, and you're selling them shoes that either are made of paper and have no nails in them, or have nothing but nails in them, or food that's just rotten and filled with worms. Why would you do that? Your crazy profits aren't going to be worth that much when you're living under the occupation. But that was just American-style capitalism at that time. But like I said, that's all over now, and we're all super ethical, and none of us ever touch a penny to which we're not entitled. Well, the owners of the Spiders bought the Cardinals, I think at bankruptcy auction. They got the St. Louis Cardinals for like $1. Again, they weren't called that then. But we're still talking about the same team, the modern Vince Coleman Cardinals. I don't know why I picked Vince Coleman instead of Stan Musial or something, but that's who we're talking about. Maybe they had advanced knowledge of the league's plan to collapse the Spiders. I don't know. But either way, in March 1899, they transferred all the good Spiders, 11 in all, to the Cardinals, even the manager, Patsy Thibault. Reds owner John T. Brush, not the world's most ethical guy, observed that it looks bad for a strong club to be made stronger at the expense of a weak club owned by the same parties. Such things hurt the game. You think, John? At that moment, he owned a chunk of the Giants as well as the Reds. He'd later sell out his Red stake and buy out the Giants' ownership, and then steal a whole bunch of players from the new American League Orioles and transfer them over to the Giants, which was the exact same thing that he was decrying as of 1899. Whereas I just told you that the later merger of the Orioles and the Dodgers, or of the Pirates and the Colonels, created really strong clubs. And it's an interesting mental exercise to try that with any two modern rosters today. Two bad teams. Could you make one good team out of them? Well, those teams weren't necessarily bad to begin with, so you created, as I said, super teams. But it didn't help the Cardinals that much, absorbing the Spiders, even though they got guys like Cy Young. And that's because most of those players, or many of them, were 2 years from jumping to the American League. And really, it was a lost decade for the Cardinals, who were good in the 1880s, as were the 1900s and 1910s. The team really didn't turn around and become the organization that we recognize today as, well, at least generally well run over a period of more than 100 years at this point. And that was when Branch Rickey showed up, but you know the rest. And I imagine that none of this is new to you, but what I wonder is how the players felt. How did this feel going through this season for the players involved? To just give you one example, pitcher Jim Huey, Coldwater Jim, went 4-30 while allowing about 8 runs per 9. Now, about a quarter of that total was unearned, but still, that couldn't have been easy for him if he had any pride whatsoever. How do you get up to do your job? And it is not a kid's game at that point when you know you're just going out there to be slaughtered for the delectation of the home crowd. And it's never the home crowd for you. Even if you're home, it's not the home crowd. It's, as I said, a spaniel named Trevor. And Trevor is a Brooklyn fan. He barks for the visitors, can actually growl E-I at Huey Jennings. It was an amazing thing. You should have been there. During that 1-40 stretch, the Browns were outscored 359 to 108 which is to say the average score against them was something like 9-3. It's easy to laugh at that, at how bad the Spiders were, and yes, retroactively we can cast it as a comedy, and I'm sure it was comic at some points, but these were also human beings who had to put on flannels, go out in the hot sun, again, hundreds of miles from where they started in most cases, in almost every case, and try their best in ball games that they had almost no chance of winning. These were players who in some cases had already had or would go on to have successful careers. They started the season with Lave Cross as player manager. He was one of the best of the early third basemen. Lou Sock Alexis, who embodied that franchise for a whole lot of people, tried an ill-fated comeback that year. Chief Zimmer was one of the best catchers of his day, and another catcher, young Ossie Schreckengast, would go on to be Rube Waddell's personal receiver and roommate with the A's, which at the very least kept his life interesting. Also short, although I'm not sure that was Waddell's fault. I know we discussed this extensively way back at the beginning, I think, of the run of the show. They also had, alternatively, players with names like Harry Cauliflower and Crazy Schmidt, who were just there to help them finish out the schedule. As the season ended, the Sporting News writer J. Ed Grillo wrote, "I saw the Cleveland players after Sunday's game, and I don't think I ever met a happier bunch of players. Had they won the pennant, they could not have expressed more joy. The fact that their season's work had ended made them happy. Every man on the team was thoroughly disgusted with the season's work. None of them wants to put in another season like the one just closed. And they didn't. They almost couldn't. You'd almost have to plan going 20-134. And as we've seen, the Robesons kind of did, but with the franchise gone, why bother? And so they went on with their lives. But the universe is strange and cruel. The Spiders' regular shortstop was named Harry Lockhead, which newspapers basically spelled like blockhead for most of his life. He was only 23 that year, but he died less than 10 years later. He was a first-generation American out of California, his parents coming from Scotland and Ireland. He played baseball as well as he could, which wasn't very well, and then worked odd jobs for the rest of his life. He developed some serious health issues, cirrhosis of the liver, probably, and you can imagine how he acquired that, although there is more than one way. In 1909, he and some friends wandered into the desert near Bakersfield and got lost. He was further debilitated by exposure and passed away a month later. I wonder if, as he began to fade out there in the Mojave, as the sun was draining his future away minute by minute, he saw one of the 81 errors he made back in 1899 and realized he had made yet another mistake, and that by coming there, he had carelessly returned to the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show. Infinite Inning number 375 in an ongoing series. I am your convivial host, Stephen Goldman, for this time travel trip to the past on a mission to better understand the present, the vehicle being, as ever, the game of baseball, although we're going to get just a little bit away from the game in the second act. In that segment, as I hinted with the trigger warning at the outset of the show, I have a little bit of a true crime story for you. But there is some baseball in there, don't worry. I cast a wide net when I research these stories, and I come across all sorts of interesting things. And as you know, since you've been here since the beginning, all 374 prior episodes, that often they interweave in interesting and surprising ways. I'm not sure that these interweave exactly, although they did happen in the same place at the same time, and the stories do kind of converge at the end. At least I hope they do. I hope you'll enjoy the ride regardless. Here's another example of all the material I sort through and the odd things that come up. As I was thinking about the Spiders, I also spent some time looking at the 1975 Tigers, a team that lost 19 consecutive games, lost 100 on the season, and started to pick up the draft picks that would help fuel the championship that eventually came in 1984. On the day that they broke that streak, Detroit Free Press columnist Joe Falls wrote, under the heading, Thurman Munson, tough to know, Yankee writers are miffed at the way catcher Thurman Munson is from the Adolf Hitler School of Public Relations. Did you wince? I winced. Also, he misspelled both Thurman and Adolf. Briefly, before we get on to a break and Act 2 of the program this week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote a column called Pitcher Abuse Points Were Woke. Maybe some of you remember pitcher abuse points, which was a stat I think Randy Jazzayerli invented them for Baseball Prospectus, which tracked how many pitches a pitcher threw in a game and their impact by tiers, because the further up you go on the scale, the more deleterious they are for the arm. And that, as I've said many times, and I've probably said it here on the show too, is really something where Baseball Prospectus led the way in correlating high pitch counts and arm injuries, and did so persuasively that eventually the industry heard it and changed the way that pitchers were handled. And what I tried to do in this story is contrast that aspect of foregoing something for the greater good, in this case, pitches, let's say 100 and up, to occasions in our greater lives, in society as a whole, where we might have the freedom to do more, to go to an extreme, but we choose not to, because even though we retain the right to do so, it's better in most cases not to exercise it in terms of the community as a whole. And although I didn't say this, and I wasn't thinking it at the time, I think part of what was pushing me was a story outside of baseball. There were two things in baseball. One was Paul Skeens carried a no-hitter into the 7th inning back about 3 days ago now, as I'm speaking to you, 4 days perhaps. And now it's natural to think, well, he's not going to get to finish that one way or the other because his pitch count is too elevated for him to safely do that. And whereas in the old days, the manager would just run him out there up to 150 pitches or more even, not that that happens that often, at least not in modern baseball, but would let him do it, sacrificing the WAR to win a battle, and an individual battle at that doesn't necessarily have any impact on whether the team succeeds or fails or not. If the team is up, say, 6-0 in the 9th inning, what do you need to stress a guy's arm for just so he can say that he did that? I admit that's deflating. No-hitters are fun. They're a great part of baseball. And more than that, whereas we can try to minimize harm to a pitcher's arm, I'm not sure that we can really stop it. If we could, there wouldn't be any more arm surgery. But given what we do know, the decision really comes down to, do you want to see Paul Skeens pitch a no-hitter today? Or do you want to see the next 100 Paul Skeens starts? Because if his arm goes, you're not going to get them. And when he comes back, he might not be the same pitcher. A few minutes ago, I observed that the Pirates are over 500 right now. They're not a lot over 500, but they are there, and Skeens is a big part of that. They have a coin flip chance of going to the postseason as a wild card. Do you want that to be the outcome of the season, or do you want to see Paul Skeens pitch a no-hitter on a Tuesday night? Those things are opposed. Life is difficult and filled with irreconcilable desires, and that will be a theme of the second act of the show as well. The other thing I was thinking about was a pitcher from well over 100 years ago, more like 150 at this point, named George Piccini, who, like the Cleveland Spiders, he was actually a little before them. He was an 1880s pitcher with the Reds, and he was left in a game to go all the way and take 20 runs of punishment. And the only thing that stops a manager from doing that today is him saying to himself, yeah, I could, but it would be a lot better if I didn't. And that brings me to the thing that I didn't mention, because I didn't realize exactly that this is what was goading me onward as I was here at my keyboard. But there was a story in the news, you might have seen it, about this insane, irresponsible jerk in Tennessee. He is a right-wing online provocateur. And his deal is that he films himself going around accosting people of color and saying things like the N-word to them. And if they, understandably, lose their cool and go to hit him, he can pull a gun and shoot them, presumably in self-defense. I guess he doesn't realize there are, 1, fighting word exceptions to freedom of speech, 2, that your right to freedom of speech is about the government not interfering with your ability to say things, not about conduct between individuals, and 3, if you're going about saying, this is what I'm trying to do, and then shoot someone, it's not exactly in self-defense, is it? It's a provocation. And, well, he succeeded in getting someone to take a swing at him, I guess, and ended up shooting that person. The person, I believe, was not fatally injured. He managed to wound himself as well and is now under arrest for attempted murder. And look, if you are going around trying to find legally protected ways to shoot Black people, there is obviously something very, very wrong with you. You're not just a bigot. You're not just an irrationally hateful person. You're malfunctioning on a very deep level that I don't even know how to describe. I mean, that would be true if you were trying to find legally protected ways to kill anyone who had done you no harm. But more than that, the point that I was trying to make and am making here now more explicitly is simply this. Even if you are a free speech absolutist, you believe that you have the right to say anything to anyone at any time, just know, I agree with you, but just as that manager can say and does say today, I have the power to do this, but it would be better in this situation if I do not. That the same thing goes for our speech and saying things that are needlessly inflammatory or hurtful of others. It's not that big an imposition to say that we should be more creative than that, we should be smarter than that, and we can make our points without injuring others, even those who we disagree with, in the same way that we can win baseball games without redlining any individual pitcher's arm. I am well overdue for a break. I have a little more to tell you about, but I'll do that on the other side, and then we'll get to Act 2 of the show and go to Philadelphia and just across the river to lovely Camden, New Jersey. I know I shouldn't laugh at that. Camden's had a rough deal over the last 100 years. I very much look forward to seeing you on the other side. Before we get to our second tale of the day, I just wanted to mention, as I usually do before the break, that over at Patreon, Dead Player of the Day goes on. We're into the 70s now. 70s in terms of the number of posts in this series. I mean, not in terms of the 1970s, although 2 players who were largely confined to that decade showed up in this week's batch. The players this week, the 4, were Dave Brain, great baseball name. He was an 1890s third baseman with a chip on his shoulder. Then we had Joe Haig, a 1970s first baseman with a chip on his shoulder. Downtown Ollie Brown, Padres 1970s outfielder with a quiet chip on his shoulder. And Vic Sayer, deadball era Tiger slugger who had a big career-ending chip in his right leg, all the way through his right leg. Yes, that's a reference to an old radio gag and probably a vaudeville-era gag that I've referred to many times before. Edgar says to Charlie, "Charlie, did you return my car after you borrowed it last night?" "Yes, but I regret to say I had a little accident." "An accident?" "Yes, just a little accident." "Is there damage?" "Yeah, a little bit of damage." "Well, I'd better go have a look at it. Where did you park it?" "Between 5th and 8th. "Where between 5th and 8th? "All the way between 5th and 8th. Big laugh, gets him every time, gets me every time. You, in fact, may be tired of my referring to it, and it's probably in bad taste given the effect that it had on Vic Sayer's career, which, by the way, is the one post I made free to all this week, so whether you are a Patreon subscriber or not, please drop by and read it. He was a really interesting player. He was an unusual player for the dead ball era. He was better than this, but I kept thinking, what if Steve Balboni played in 1910? And I'm especially sensitive to this broken leg thing literally right now, because not long before I began this second segment of the episode, Clay Holmes of the Mets, who was having a terrific year starting for them, took a ball off his leg. I believe Spencer Jones hit it, and it seems like it's broken, and he's going to be gone for the foreseeable future. And I feel awful about that because he's had a really fascinating and mostly effective career, at least since he got away from the Pirates, which is true of a lot of pitchers. It's all sort of unconventional. He's a ground ball guy. I realize he could be frustrating as a closer for the Yankees. He failed in some big spots, as most closers do at times. And in both roles, sometimes he'll just spontaneously lose track of the strike zone. But this year he had an ERA, at least heading into his start on Friday, as I say these words, of well under 2. And I think some of that was definitely luck, definitely balls in play, finding gloves. I don't know if it would have lasted forever, but now it won't get to, and that's really unfortunate. So no jokes about broken legs. And so to our next tale. This is not a baseball story, not purely, although I came across it while pursuing one. As a longtime married person who has been in the same relationship for over 30 years now, it's hard for me to grapple with that. I'm in sort of a permanent state of disbelief about how much time has gone by. I think about the way human beings bind themselves to one another quite a bit. And that is not to say that I'm unhappy in my marriage, in that relationship, but I would be lying to you if I said that I never experienced any turbulence in it, or doubt about it, or struggled within myself as to my feelings at any given moment, both because of internal and external forces working on me, and because, if you're lucky, you don't stay the same person for 30 years. So you're constantly having to recalibrate your orientation towards this big center of gravity in your life, which is your relationship. And as I've said many times here on the show, at one point, at what was probably the lowest and stupidest point of my life, I did my best to mess things up, and I thank the stars each day that I didn't succeed. Again, that doesn't mean that I've never thought about alternative lives, either for myself or others that I know, or for people in general. When I look at the systems that humanity has created for itself, whether it's marriage or the nuclear family, or our various forms of government or economy, I ask myself what aspects of them were inevitable, in some subtle way dictated by our biology, by evolution, and which seem like permanent features but are likely transient. They're just of this time, or of recent times, or even of a 1,000 years, which is not that long in the grand scheme of things. In terms of human lives, yes. In terms of the world, no. What alternatives might have existed at one time, or could exist in the future, and why have the former not been successful in more than transient ways? With marriage, I wonder to what extent the institution comes out of our desire to control people and yoke them to a plot of land or a certain job, or for a certain set of aristocrats across history, almost inevitably male, and their desire to control a woman or a group of women. And then on the opposite side of that, I wonder if people, on the whole, are just inclined to be like certain species of birds, which mate for life, and are just happier being in a stable, steady couple. It does seem like the majority of us are not just programmed that way societally, but gravitate towards it. Otherwise, it wouldn't repeat itself over and over again in a wide variety of times and places. On one hand, especially once you have kids, one can see the value in sort of a communal style of living where an entire community parents children. On the other hand, people are so insane that hands off my kids, for God's sake, who would you trust that way? Not that many people. I'm sure sometimes you even look askance at your own parents or in-laws. Gonna leave the kids with the grandparents and have a date night. Well, wait a minute. Your parents are crazy. The same thing goes for poly relationships or ethical non-monogamy and all those alternative lifestyles that have been popular with some people at some times. I'm all for that if that works for you. I have no judgment about that on a moral or religious or any basis, really. But wow, managing two people is hard. Simultaneously, on a third hand, when reading a novel or watching a film based on the infidelity plot, or even observing it in real life, I sometimes ask myself if all this drama is really necessary, or was there some other way of handling it in which everyone could get their needs met and not have felt betrayed? Maybe if the system that we have had allowed everyone to be honest about their desires in the first place without fearing reprisal, because I think fear leads to the lie, and there's never any excuse for the lie. you're just automatically in the wrong at that point. And certainly there are those among us, even those who we love, who may be just inclined to be dishonest or immoral or selfish, but I think other people who would not ordinarily be that way get into kind of a Star Trek mad AI logic loop. They find that they need or want something, but know they can't have it, and yet they need it. Can't, must, can't, must, can't, must. And then the computer explodes and Captain Kirk goes home happy. And even though he had a strings-free night with the alien princess along the way, he has no empathy for your conflict. I was reading the August 25th, 1943 issue of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was looking for a story about the A's related to the first segment of the show today. It's also just what I do. You were probably watching some hilarious sitcom, but I was catching up on the Connie Mack operation and also the possibility that we had just shot down Japan's Admiral Yamamoto, the fellow who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. You know, the place where Kash Patel just went swimming over the tomb of the martyred sailors on the Arizona. Let me give you the second part of this first. The Inquirer happened to have that day an advice column in the ladies section written by one Martha Foster. This question was asked by what sounds like a young woman. It ran under the title, "Women Cannot Truthfully Love Two Men at One Time." Dear Martha Foster, 9 years ago, I married one of the finest men on earth and was very happy until a year ago when I went to work in a defense plant and met a man who means more to me than my own life. He is married and has a daughter. My husband has lavished all the affection and generosity on me that a wife could ask. I have wanted for nothing, yet I cannot help myself. I know this other love is wrong. When we first started going out together, I never dreamed things would get serious between us. This man even quit his job at the plant and took another so we wouldn't see each other so often, but it did no good. My husband enlisted last January and wants me to come live near his camp, but I've told him I couldn't because of my job. This man will be in the army soon too, and we will be parted. What I'll do then, I don't know, for it almost kills me to be away from him. Is it possible for a woman to love two men at the same time? I think I do, in different ways. All our promises to stay away from each other just don't keep. Please tell me what to do. Signed, Unhappy. Miss Foster replied under the heading Selfish Attitude. You can't run away from promises, Unhappy. Nor does the Almighty make any allowances for those who say they're sorry for what they've done and who then go right on doing it. You may try to sound repentant, but you're not. Knowing that you have erred is only beginning toward betterment. So far, your whole attitude has been a selfish one. Ask yourself this. Can I ever face my husband and the hurt look in his eyes once he knows? Could I ever stand being hurt the way that he's going to be? That is the true test. Answer those questions honestly and see whether you've been honest even with yourself in this whole pitiful affair. Rather than comment on that, let me just proceed to the story that got me thinking along these lines. It was the same day, and the headline was, 200 see woman slain by secret sweetheart. Assailant fires 4 shots at victim, 44, in Camden, and then attempts suicide. As I said earlier, that Camden is the one in southern New Jersey. If you ever happen to find yourself crossing New Jersey to get to the Benjamin Franklin Bridge into Philadelphia, thereby to reach the Phillies or some other worthy spot, you will pass through Camden. As you do, look out to your left and you'll see a brown building with a tower on it. It's been turned into condominiums in recent years, but that building used to be part of the headquarters of RCA, one of the big companies that, in better days, resided in the city of Camden and provided jobs there. You should be able to see from the roadway that the top of the tower holds 4 large, round, stained glass windows containing the His Master's Voice image of a dog listening to a phonograph that was RCA Victor's trademark just going back about 100 years now. I always find that poignant because RCA no longer exists in the same sense, and as a result of that and other departures, Camden didn't exist in the same way either. And seeing Nipper back up there, it seems to me, is a good sign for the city and evidence of its resilience. In that city, again, on August 25th, 1943, a 51-year-old man named Leon Louis Ciroli killed his wife. The woman's name was Mary Mozzo, although people knew her as Mrs. Mary Stern. She was actually closer to 41 than 44, despite the headline. She was waiting for a train to take her across the bridge into Philadelphia when Ciroli, again her husband, walked up to her, said, "Mary, can I speak to you?" and then shot her in the back with a .32 caliber pistol. She fell. He shot her 3 more times, then put the gun in his own mouth and pulled the trigger. She was dead. He was not. Ciroli, a boiler man on one of the local railroad lines, lived in the not exactly nearby town of Elm with his wife Elizabeth, not Mary. He had 2 married daughters and a son. He had also been married to Mary for 21 years. Elizabeth supposedly had no clue. Ciroli had shot himself through the mouth, but he lived. And I'll talk about what happened next on the other side of our second and final break of the episode. When the police got to Ciroli, they found a note on his person saying, "For 20 years I've been mixed up with the wrong woman," and that he was going to try to do something about that, and he hoped he succeeded. Which woman? One paper reported that his motive was jealousy, but I'm not sure what they based that on. Ciroli right off said he was guilty, and with 200 witnesses in a train station, you'd think he didn't have a lot of wiggle room there, but New Jersey state law back then said you had to go through with the trial anyway. In March 1944, Ciroli pleaded no contest to a charge of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Elizabeth stuck by him. She was there with him in court and seems to have stuck by him thereafter. They're buried together here in New Jersey. However, his life sentence turned out to be very brief. He died in 1945. I'm not sure under what circumstances. Pictures of him show a scrawny little reprobate, balding with glasses, and I wonder how the hell he found the energy to work for the railroad, pay the slightest attention to his wife, the first one I mean, visit with his adult kids whenever they came home, and also be the apparently semi-estranged husband of a whole other woman, one he had maybe picked up when she was about 20 or 21? Where did he get the money to front 2 households over a 20-year period that included the Great Depression? He wasn't a Rockefeller, he was a low-level railroad man. Did she know? Why was all of that worth it? Was there another way? Certainly there was another way short of murder, that goes without saying, but jealousy is a weird, twisting emotion, although how can one be jealous of a woman to whom one has no right? How can one be such a narcissist that he or she can say, yes, I have a claim on both these people, even though neither of them has consented to the arrangement. And further, my claim is so strong and so essential to me that should one of them try to exit the situation, I reserve the right to execute them for daring to do so. And what does any of that have to do with love or even domestic stability? It's the opposite of that. I only became aware of this story because on the date that Ciroli murdered Mozzo in 1943, the Philadelphia Athletics broke a 20-game losing streak. The A's, who would go 49 and 105 that year, hadn't had many good players before the war, but now most of the viable players were off playing or fighting or both for Uncle Sam. It amuses the heck out of me that 2 of that old bigot Connie Mack's best players were outfielder Bobby Estelalea of Cuba, who was most likely passing, or at least possibly passing, and pitcher Jesse Flores of Mexico. The A's lost every game from August 7th through the first game of a doubleheader on August 24th. I thought Connie might have had a comment. He didn't, at least not one that I saw, but after they dropped the first game of the doubleheader on August 24th, this was at Comiskey Park against the White Sox, the A's had knuckleballer Roger Wolf pitching the second game. Wolf was good during the war. A couple of years later, he would go 20-10 with a 2.12 ERA for the Washington Senators. In losing Game 1, the A's had tied the longest losing streak in American League history, a record which was set by the Red Sox in 1906, a team that in particular suffered for having no pitching. Here's Denton True Young again. Cy was 39 that year. He wasn't done, but he did have the one off year of his basically entire life from birth through his mid-40s. And one of the fascinating things about that is that even though his ERA was 3.19 in a league in which the average was 2.69, just look at his top line numbers. He threw 287 in 2/3 innings, allowed 288 hits, so basically even. He walked only 25 or 0.8 per 9 and struck out 140, which was the best strikeout walk ratio in the league. That's not a pitcher having a bad year, and by FIP, his ERA was 1.87, the best in the American League. So somehow he was victimized by poor luck or poor sequencing or the defenders just being drunk in every game that he started. I really don't understand it, but in any case, that was part of the Red Sox setting that record. Before the second game in 1943, Mack spoke. "You can either set a record or break the string," Mack told Wolf. Somehow, the A's, who had scored 3.2 runs per game all year, put 8 men across the plate that day, while Wolf held the pale hose to just 1 run, that unearned, and the streak was over. Mack's words here are actually pretty good ones in terms of lessons for us. On one hand, he was stating the obvious, and on the other, he was outlining a pretty stark choice. You can't will the outcome of a sporting event, obviously, no matter how many movies pretend that you can. You can't really will the outcome of much of anything, but where you do have choices, you can make good ones. I think that the signals our minds and our bodies send to us about our love lives, about desire, about want, are complicated and not always easily deciphered in real time, if they ever are. I disagree with 1943 advice columnist Martha Foster about it being impossible to love 2 people at one time, but in different ways. That isn't selfish. That's just the fact of human variety and the kinds of people that we might encounter as we go through the world. That even if you can love one person in a million, there are a lot of people out there for you. And they might be very, very different. And that difference in and of itself may stimulate attraction. But that doesn't mean you have to go for it. And just feeling it isn't selfish, it's being alive. It's what you do with it that's selfish. If you pursue it in some way that's harmful to yourself or any number of other people. I think part of maturity is accepting that you can love someone and be committed to them and simultaneously understand without self-condemnation that you're still receiving signals from the outside. The part that requires maturity is understanding that you don't have to do anything about it and that you're not going to. One of my favorite lyrics in this regard, and I have Mike Ferrin to thank for introducing me to this album, is by John Hartford. It's from a song called The First Girl I Loved. And John Hartford sings, among many other wise things in that song, "I regret my life won't be long enough to make love to all the women that I'd like to, or least of all to live with the ones I've loved." And even within that verse, there's kind of a climb down from immaturity to maturity. He goes from saying, "I'm sorry I won't get to have as much sex as I'd like to." Well, wait, hold on. That's not the part that matters. The part that I'm really going to miss out on is that I won't get to fully live out all the love that I've experienced. We really don't get enough time to do that. You'd have to be living several parallel lives at once. And that is kind of tragic in a way for all of us. There are many different lives we could have lived with many different experiences of loving and being in love. And I don't just mean, and Hartford didn't just mean the experience of attraction or affection or romance, but the whole skein of it, the whole 30 years that I've been fortunate enough to have. But that's not the way it's going to go for most of us, or the vast majority of us. Even with a secret second family, you couldn't possibly do that. You'd just be fooling yourself. And it's something that we have to accept. To not accept it is to go to a very dark, frustrated, thwarted place. If you do find yourself in whatever dark place Louis Ceroli reached, you can either set a record, an evil record, or break the string, walk away, save your life, save her life. You know, the one you claim to love. Good news, though, even though it was unresolved in that issue of the Philadelphia Inquirer from 1943, we did win the war. It reminds me of Randy Newman's song, New Orleans Wins the War, in which his dad comes back from World War II, tells New Orleans that they've won, but they get a little confused about which war it was. It's a funny but very accurate take, as evidenced by the response to the Supreme Court's functional repeal of the Voting Rights Act this week. If you're smarter than me, you'd repeal your access to social media, but you can follow me there at stephengoldman.bsky.social, and you can write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. There remains a Facebook group. I dropped a shot of the ill-fated Harry Lockhead of the Cleveland Spiders in there this week. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, because that's the thing that keeps this machine going, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. And on that note, I would like to welcome Carlos. Thank you so much, Carlos. I hope you enjoy the posts. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, go into the podcast theme songwriting business and give me a longer clip so I can vamp more at the end of these shows. Speaking of which, our theme song was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring. So who do I have to blame? Me and my best friend. Dr. Rick reminds us that our ability to govern our passions is inversely proportional to the expanse of our wounds. This is not an excuse, but the beginning of understanding ourselves and limiting our desires. Well, if I can just figure out where he came up with that, has that fella been reading the Stoics or what? I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.